My name is Kendra Kraisser, and I'm a senior at the Bowling Green campus of the Chesapeake Bay Governor School. My study was titled Keep Calm and Study On, the Correlation Between Academic Performance and Grade Satisfaction and Student Stress Levels. I chose this topic because high school is a really stressful time, and I wanted to test how other students dealt with their stress as well. For a bit of an overview, I had my driving question, which I was looking for a possible correlation between secondary students' stress levels and their satisfactions and grade performance and academic performance, as well as I'll be going over some background about my theories of stress, the components of academic stress, and what it is, and the validation of the testing tool I used. As well as that, I have my methods about my QASSE survey that I administered to the sophomores, juniors, and seniors at the Bowling Green campus of Chesapeake Bay Governor School on 4 separate dates. And then for my results and conclusions, my data was statistically significant with a negative correlation between the satisfaction and stress levels of secondary students. When it comes to stress research, there are 2 theories. The first one being Selye's theory of systemic stress, which has an organism's reaction to a stress over a period of time, and it follows the general adaptation syndrome response. And it goes through 3 stages, with the first being the alarm stage, which is the introduction of that stressor, the second stage being resistance, which is the organism's reaction to the stressor, and the third stage being exhaustion, in which the organism either adapts or succumbs to the stressor itself. And then the second theory is the Lazarus theory of psychological stress, which my study follows, and it is more about how different people react to a similar stressor and like the similarities and differences between that. And then when it comes to academic stress, there are 4 components. The first one being frustration, which is failure. The second being conflict, which comes from poor time management. The third being pressure, which is comes from deadlines, and the fourth being anxiety, which comes from a fear of failure. And then the questionnaire on academic stress in secondary education, the QASSE, was the testing tool I used, but it was created in a previous study by Garcia, Ross, Perez, Gonzalez, and Tomas in 2018, and they created this questionnaire to test the components of stress between males and females in different grade levels in secondary education, and they found that they could design and adjust educational prevention and intervention actions as well using that testing tool. For my hypotheses, my null was that there was no significant correlation between academic performance and grade satisfaction in students and their stress levels, while my alternative was that with increased academic performance and grade satisfaction, stress levels of the students would be decreased, and vice versa, that with decreased satisfaction levels, the stress would be higher in those students. So for my variables, I had 2 independent variables being the academic performance satisfaction and grade satisfaction, and my dependent variable being stress levels. Along with those, I had moderating variables like gender, grade level, high-level courses of my participants, and their co-curricular activities as well. And in this graph, it shows the advanced level courses being taken by those, and it was a sample of convenience because I only took the scores from the students at Chesapeake Bay Governor School, so their classes were higher levels and more elevated than what can be expected at a typical high school, and that is shown with a third of them taking 4 high-level classes, a third taking 5, and last they're taking a mixture of 3, 6, and 7. So aside that, for my participants, I had 25 to 35 students per survey session, and that number differed due to absences, different class sizes, as well as opting out. So on the left is the example of the questions used in the QASSE, and out of those 30, I chose 16 of them that best fit my data, and they fit into 3 subcategories, being academic overload, which had questions dealing with taking exams, academic overload, the lack of time, studying, having too much responsibility, keeping up in class, doing well in class, creating leisure time, and doing poorly on exams. The second category was family-teacher pressures, which had questions pertaining to family pressures, teacher pressures, and parents being on top of a student about their grades. And the third category was class interaction, which had questions pertaining to intervening in class, which is just talking in class, dealing with your teacher outside of class, competitiveness among your classmates, and then working together with your classmates. So beside my questions for the QSSE, I also had questions pertaining to my moderating variables, as well as 2 questions that asked the participant what their satisfaction levels were for the past week on their grade performance and academic performance. And so I had 4 survey days per grade level, and that was about 1 a week, and that couldn't be randomized because it had to be taken during class. So it was decided that it would be changed every single week so the students wouldn't miss the same class week after week. but the questions were randomized to help prevent that bias. So this is an example of what my survey looked like with every single question, except for the moderating variables being on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very low or very dissatisfied, and 5 being very high or very satisfied. So this top one is an example of what the satisfaction questions look like, where it's just asked on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you right now with your recent academic performance in school? And the bottom one shows how I set up the QASSE questions, where it listed all of them and it asked the student to look back on their past week and determine how much stress the following factors caused them on that same scale of 1 to 5. So this table shows my correlations between the sources of stress and academic satisfaction, and it's split up between academic performance and grade, and then also the 3 subcategories of total stress as well. So my sample size, I had 189 samples across it all, and my Pearson's R values were, that measures the strength of association between 2 variables to determine the relationship of them on a scale of -1 to 1, with how, if that number is close to that -1 or 1, it shows how strong that relationship is. And these numbers may look strong, but because it was a human participant study, they're actually very highly significant. And I wanted to draw attention to the academic overload categories for both of them and how they measured the highest out of all 3 subcategories of stress, and that'll be explained more later. Then my p-values are all less than 0.01, which means my data was statistically significant and I can reject my null hypothesis. And then my R-squared values, they don't really affect my study, but that just shows how the data follows a trend line. So this shows the overall correlation between academic performance satisfaction and total stress scores, with the academic performance satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 5 being on the x-axis, and the y-axis having total stress scores of the participants. So because this has a negative correlation, this means that with higher satisfaction, which is on the right, the students typically felt less stress, while with the least satisfaction being the one on the left, they'd have the most stress, and because of that, it creates a negative correlation. So this shows the strength of correlation by Pearson's R numbers between academic performance and satisfaction and total stress levels of 33 participants, with my Pearson R values being on my x-axis and the frequency of the answers of the participants on the y-axis. Now I chose frequency because across my 4 testing dates, the students would put in a code and they were able to track their scores throughout it, so we were able to see how their stress might have differed across the 4 weeks that I took this study. So across those weeks, 8 students said that with the most stress, they were the least satisfied, and so they fit into the -1 to -0.75 bin. And then 7 students said that with a little less stress, they were still less satisfied, so they fit into the -7.5 to -0.5 bin. This graph shows the overall correlation between grade satisfaction and total stress scores, with grade satisfaction being on the x-axis and the y-axis having my total stress scores. And like the other one, it has that negative correlation with being least satisfied has the most stress, and being the most satisfied has the least stress, following that negative trend. So this one shows the strength of correlation between grade satisfaction and total stress levels for 29 participants, with Pearson's R values being on the x-axis and frequency being on the y. So as the same as the other one, it shows that with low satisfaction levels, there were high stress, so 7 students fit into the -1 to -0.75 bin. But oddly enough, it also showed that high stress levels didn't really mean low satisfaction, because 7 students also fit into the 0 to 0.25 bin. So this graph shows why that academic overload measured so high, and so this one shows the strength of correlation between grade satisfaction and academic overload for 30 participants, with Pearson's R values being on the x-axis and the frequency of numbers being on the y. And this shows that with that high levels of stress, 11 students felt it came mostly from academic overload, and so that they fit into the -1 to -0.75 bin. So for my conclusions, negative correlations were found between each variable, which allowed me to reject my null hypothesis, and it was shown that high school students are the most worried about their grades when it came to things that directly affected them, and that was shown through academic overload questions scoring the highest, class interactions scoring second, and the family teacher pressures scoring third. If I were to do a future study, I want to include my moderating variables more, so I could also just test if there were differences between male and females, as well as the grade levels. And then if I had a longer testing period, I'd be able to make sure there'd be more participants and also test it across the whole semester, dealing with vacations and breaks as well.